Yes. So Irma, if you move to the next one. Yes, great. So there we are. There was a first session of negotiations starting end of April into May 2024, and then highlighted in red here, the so-called zero draft terms of reference were published on 7th June. And several organizations and countries and academics have filed some answers or comments to the zero draft. And we here for the next 2 hours will mainly focus on the zero draft terms of reference. But what is important to understand is that probably in the course of next week, we will see the next version of the terms of reference to be shared among member states and other stakeholders. Why that? Because beginning end of July and going into mid-August, there will be the second session, the second round of negotiations on the terms of reference. Now, this is important to note because we are still talking about the terms of reference. So we are not yet talking about the actual framework convention, but the framework convention will be based on the terms of reference and will be negotiated. And that is currently the plan, at least what is publicly available, during several sessions in 2025 and 2026. So the ultimate goal would be to have an approval of the Framework Convention in the 81st session of the UN General Assembly, which is to happen in September 2026. So on the next slide, Irma, you'll see the outline of the zero draft. Just, that we are all on the same, with the same base here. So there is a section on the preamble, on the objectives and the principles. There is a section on the substantive elements of the Framework Convention, on capacity building, on the structural elements of the Framework Convention, and last, on what the UN or the ad hoc committee calls early protocols. And I think the last session is very important. Now, in the next 2 hours, I think several of the participants will refer to some of the chapters here. So I think it's important to understand what currently is the content of the zero draft. But as we can see on the next slide, as an example, for instance, if we talk about the substantive elements, the zero draft still contains a lot of options. So we don't yet know what will be, the final draft, but there is a variety of options to be included. Here, just on the substantive elements, for instance, fair allocation of taxing rights, equitable taxation of M&Es, effective taxation of high net worth individuals, fight climate change, etc. So there is still a lot of room for negotiations. Let's say we are still at the beginning of the project, but the goal of the next 2 hours is really to talk about how such a project could be successful. Now that brings me to the program, which is on the last slide. We will have 2 longer sessions. A first one of approximately 1 hour, where we debate the current content of the zero draft and what is missing. And then we particularly focus on the question of how can we ensure that, we find the lowest common denominator among the highest amount of countries in order to make the Framework Convention a successful project. And last, we close with a shorter session on the future. What is next? Is the project to fail? Or is this really going to be a successful initiative that will, go as planned and end in a final approval by the UN General Assembly in September 2026. So having said that, if Irma, you don't have anything to add, I will directly hand over to Martin to make an introduction on the first session. And I would ask the speakers to introduce themselves. I forgot that. So my name is Peter Hongler. I'm a professor of tax law and very happy to have you all on board. So Martin, thank you for taking over here.
Okay. Thanks very much to Peter and to everyone who's joined us. I see we're up to 76 people now, so it's a nice, healthy room. So in this session, we're going to look a bit more at the latest draft of the terms of reference. So that's the zero draft that Peter just talked through, and we're going to look at what's in there and what's missing and what we can anticipate about the next stage of negotiations based on what we see that's in there. So we're going to have four speakers. I'll just briefly mention who they are. So we'll begin with Claudia Vargas, who represents Colombia on the ad hoc group of the negotiating the terms of reference for the UN Convention. Then we have Frederick Heitmuller, who works with us at ICTD on the International Tax Program. Then we'll have Ima Mosquera, I think known very well to all of you from the University of Leiden and the GlobTaxGov project. And finally, Peter, who has just introduced himself, so needs no further introduction. Okay, so let's hand straight over to Claudia for her remarks.
Hi, thank you, and good evening, good morning for everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, Irma, for this invitation. I just wanted to mention, first of all, that this is a very interesting process from Colombia's view. It is a very important process. You know that Colombia is a member of the OECD. We have been involved in the all the negotiations at the OECD of the Pillar 2 solution and other negotiations. And there's or there has been like a big question mark around this process, especially the difference or the tension between developed and developing countries. In my view, Colombia has a very special situation because we are in both sides. I always say that we are an OECD country, but we are also a developing country. And this means or I would say this does not mean that we are not involved in the different negotiations around the world in the different forums. As you may know, Colombia voted in favor of Resolution 278. I believe this is a very important decision in the tax world. It has opened the door to have further discussions on tax issues at the UN. And what I would like to say about that, first of all, is that is very good. It's very positive to see developed and developing countries really involved, really engaged in these discussions at the UN. As you have seen in the resolution itself and in the zero draft, where the preamble refers to the different General Assembly resolutions and the objectives and principles. This is a process that calls for all countries to engage in tax discussions, having in mind that nowadays it is clear that tax issues, there are a lot of tax issues and very important issues, economic issues, health issues, environmental issues that should be addressed in a global way. So it is time for countries to realize this and to move forward into a more cooperative discussion. I would say, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, there are things that haven't been addressed. There are issues that haven't been addressed in some forum, not because there is a lack of political commitment to do so, but because we have a lot of issues. We need our world has to get involved in a lot of important issues that that cannot be addressed at a specific or one time at one time all. So it is positive for all of us, I would say, that this fora has been opened, which doesn't mean that the other discussions that have been going on should be closed or should stop. In our view, this is not the purpose. No, the purpose is not to, or should not be, to decide where the discussion should be taken, but to have another fora to discuss some issues that have not been dealt with yet. So this process call for inclusiveness, call for, and what I have seen being both sides, let's say, is that is very important for countries to take their voice, to raise their voice, whether at the OECD, whether at the UN, whether regionally. That's another issue that I would like to raise, that regional discussions on tax issues is very important. We have seen, I mean, it's very difficult to classify countries, even within this classification of developed, undeveloping, or in different regions around the world. You will always find differences, very important differences within each group. So it is important to for countries to be able to highlight their interests, to share and to explain their specific situation. And to give you an example, within the UN, we have a group, one of the regional groups, in which Colombia is the Latin American and Caribbean group. And still within this group, there are a lot of differences. The interests, the situation, the capabilities, the economy, the tax system of the Caribbean islands versus the South American countries are different, which means that this is already a basic point where the tax issues need to take into account the different situations in order to be able to address correctly in a very effective way the needs of the different countries. So the process in the UN has allowed some member countries to raise their voice, to emphasize their situation, to explain and to make it clear that not everything is suitable for every country and that the different issues need to be addressed. So as Peter mentioned, this process so far is drafting the terms of reference. And it has been a very interesting process to see all the views, what is important for some countries, what is important for other countries. It has not been, I would say, an easy process, mainly because of all these differences, but this in international negotiations and multilateral negotiations, I think it is important to note that we have more than 190 countries at the table, and to get to some agreements, all of us will have to lose something and to gain something. But I think the process itself, it's already very, very positive. There have been a lot of discussions around what should be in the terms of reference. The organizational session, the first session, and the different meetings that we as a bureau have had have led to the zero draft that you all have been able to see at the published at the UN webpage. it's interesting to see even the wording, the process, the draft says this does not necessarily represent the unanimous view of all bureau members, which reflects already the difficulties of these topics and of this process. We have been in the bureau, we have been working already in some modifications to the zero draft. You will see them shortly before the second session. But what it is important there is to know, or what I want to also to emphasize here, is that all different members are engaged, are really engaged and participating in a constructive way in these discussions. Different specific topics have been discussed. Well, and this is something for tax people like me very interesting, that the process at the UN, this is the first time that this kind of topics are discussed at the UN. At the UN, we have the tax committee of experts, but it is not an intergovernmental committee, and it has specific areas of work, but this process is, as was mandated by the resolution of the General Assembly, an intergovernmental process, and the bureau is formed in a way that represents all regional groups in a very balanced way. So we have 4 members of each regional group. In our case, in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, we had 8 countries wanting to be part of the bureau. So we were able to decide that 4 countries were going to be doing the first period of the first half of this period, and other 4 countries were going to come to the table during the second part of this period. I was part of the bureau during the first period, but we continue as observers now that Bolivia has taken place as member of the bureau. But we have a very good representation of all the regions around the world, and this allows to see different views, to have very important discussions on what should be there, what principles, what is important to include in the zero draft. This is a skeleton, is a proposal that the bureau will bring to the General Assembly. This text should be finalized in the session by the middle of August, and you will see there so the preamble, the objectives, the principles. I would say that there are some areas that are not so that is easy to agree on, but there are other areas that start to bring some issues, some principles. For example, there's a discussion of if some principles need to be expressly there, or if it is just something that is already recognized around the world and you don't need to put it there. And it's also important to note that these terms of reference are the ones that are shaping the negotiation of the convention. Having in mind anyway that this is a proposal, that the General Assembly is the deciding body, not the committee, and further discussions, amendments, or other issues may be included by the General Assembly when they will discuss these terms of reference in the plenary. And you will be you will see the substantive elements of the Framework Convention. This is a very important part because it has been evidence that it is very important not only to refer to the structure of the convention or the framework that the negotiators will have to discuss and to agree on the text of the convention, but also to determine or to highlight some substantive issues that have been identified as important as they need to be in the convention. They need to be discussed under the Framework Convention. The resolution 278 already mentioned two, which were illicit financial flows and taxation of cross-border services. And as this was already in the resolution, the first discussions, even during the organizational session, were about this already. What do these two items mean? And it seems that even that basic part may have different views and different meanings for developed countries and for developing countries. But it has been clarified anyway that in the terms of reference, there will be some issues proposed by the Bureau to the General Assembly, but at the end of the day, the General Assembly will decide. And the Framework Convention, it's the purpose is not only to deal with these specific issues, but to have a framework, to have a space where different tax matters may be globally discussed. And this is also important, is to take into account what is currently in working, the different commitments that all the countries have under previous or current international tax instruments. For example, Colombia, we are part of different multilateral conventions that are already in place, that we are committed to, that we have obligations under those instruments, and that are mechanisms that are working for us. And this is something that, in my view, should not be lost. We cannot just ignore what has been carrying on, or the work that has been carried on in previously. And my personal call would be, or is always, let's see what we have. Of course, that many things and many instruments and mechanisms may be improved, and improvement is always welcome, but not ignore what has been advanced, what has and what may be working for a lot of our countries. And regarding those priority areas, Colombia has been very vocal in two issues. We believe that taxation of high net worth individuals and finding additional tax measures on environmental and climate challenges is very important. These are matters, for example, that have not been dealt yet by other bodies. Taxation of high net worth individuals, I mean, there has been already a lot of work around corporate taxation, but we do need to see what happens with individuals. It goes actually in line with the proposal under the G20 Brazilian presidency. And at the end of the day, the structures and the different bodies and partnerships or companies or wherever, individuals are behind this, and they are able to move very easily. And it is important that they start to pay, to contribute with their share to all the needs of the world, and that goes also with the climate challenge. It is we believe these two issues need to be addressed globally. It is a problem not of a country, it's not a territorial measure that would be enough to deal with this. So climate challenge, I think that it's evident that it's something that we all are already suffering, and that previous measures have not been enough, and that we need to address and to study and to commit to finding additional measures from a tax point of view to address these issues. So the idea of these early protocols is
Claudia, sorry to interrupt you, but I think you will have only 1 minute left, because then after you will be in the what is next. I was trying to reach out to Martin.
Okay, sorry. So just one last thing, maybe to understand the importance of early protocols, is that the convention, the negotiation of the convention, it is estimated to take around a year and a half or 2 years, and this will start in 2025. So this means that the convention probably we will have a final text by the end of 2026. So we have raised, and many countries have raised a concern about this, because we need to address some matters very urgently. So the idea is to be able to advance in parallel with the negotiation of the text of these early protocols, in order to have something already very advanced, either to sign those protocols with or at the same time with the convention, or very close after the signing of this convention, because we need to move forward. And the idea of this process is to be able to be very efficient and bring some solutions very soon. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Claudia. Very interesting to get your reflections, which I think relate to this panel and the next panel as well, when we'll talk about what specifically is in and out. So I'm going to hand over now to Frederick, who's going to talk next.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you very much also Irma and Peter for the invitation to talk at this roundtable. Okay, today I want to talk about two things mainly. First, I want to talk about the zero draft about the TOR, what is in them, what not, and my interpretation of it. So what it says about the status at which the negotiations are at the moment. And later, I want to say a few things about different ways, different possible strategies in which, in particular, proponents of the process in the first place, how they could take things forward. In the interest of time, maybe I will just reserve the second topic for later. But no, so first on the zero draft of the TOR, what is in there and what should not, what is not there and what should be there, as already Peter explained and Claudia now, is that the TOR covers a range of areas, including objectives, principles, commitments, topics for early protocols. It talks about capacity building, as well as about procedural issues, which are called structural issues there, and approaches for the negotiating body. I would say overall there is a lot in these terms of reference already, but at the same time not that much. Like, since as many of the submissions to input to the input process afterwards highlighted that many of the aspects that are in there are still relatively vague. We do not really know yet where things go there afterwards. And I would attribute that So first of all, of course, to the nature of the process. So as highlighted already by Peter, we're talking here about a process to draft terms of reference, not yet about the negotiation of the actual committee. And if I recall correctly from last year, the original draft resolution did not yet talk about this terms of reference process, but this terms of reference process was inserted presumably in order to reach to get a broader number of countries on board. So some of that I would say is in the nature of the process. So countries probably do not want to tie their hands too much at this stage already. That's why on the one hand many terms are put in there that are relatively vague, and so in order to not prejudge too much what is going to happen afterwards. Also, if you read especially the input statements, you see that a lot of the items that are in there are still controversial. Many countries, it seems reading the submissions of member states, in particular those from the global north, that a lot of those topics that are in the terms of reference may still be opened up again in the discussions in New York in 2 weeks. Those of you who've read the introduction to the terms of reference see that actually what was proposed as zero draft wasn't a consensus document of the whole bureau of the ad hoc committee. So what is it that is most controversial in these terms of reference? Reading the input, one can see that from the perspective of the countries in the global north, the underlying concerns are still that, first of all, most of these countries do not want that this process results in a lot of binding commitments that could potentially result in a rearrangement of existing standards that govern international taxation. And on the other hand, they would prefer that the process stays out of topics that have been already dealt with or that have in the past mainly been dealt with at the OECD. That's why many of them reject one of the objectives in the terms of reference, which is the establishment of a system of governance, since that would imply like the creation of a body that could take decisions. Instead, they just want a framework which would be presumably less binding. Many have objections to substantive commitments such as fair allocation of taxing rights and possibly illicit financial flows, since they might put a question mark on some of the standards of the OECD. Very notable also, and this has been noted probably by most global north countries, is the absence in the terms of reference of a broader discussion of procedural issues, especially voting. So it's no mystery that already in the last sessions there was a lot of discussion about should decisions be taken through a voting procedure, whether that's by a majority or by supermajority, or can only consensus results in a decision. And this can be explained essentially by the same underlying issues, in my opinion, that most of the global countries in the global north probably would not like this convention to take very far-reaching decisions. That's why this emphasis on consensus is there. On the other hand, for countries in the in the global south that have a majority, it's more convenient to leave the issue altogether out of the terms of reference, because it means that the default way of taking decisions, which is the General Assembly rules, would likely continue. From the perspective of the countries in the global south, the most controversial is likely that the terms of reference still make some positive reference to the work of fora such as the OECD, and of course that's as Claudia already mentioned before, there's probably no unanimous view of all countries, so especially countries that are both members of the OECD and that are developing countries, but possibly also other countries that have had positive experiences with fora such as the OECD. So this is just an overview of what I read as the most controversial issues. I don't think that the session in 2 weeks will fundamentally resolve all these issues. So what is most likely to happen is probably that a somewhat watered down draft may be accepted, and then the real negotiations will happen over the next 2 years. So and that leads me to one of my final remarks is that I think for some it might look like reading these inputs and also reflecting what I just said is that there's a big gap between the expectations of different groups of countries. But given that we're still in this process of elaborating a TOR, I'm not sure whether this gap is as big as one could read it in these statements. So if we look at it from the perspective of the negotiation, it does make sense, I think, for the participants to not seek too many compromises right now, because there's still a couple of years in which these negotiations will go on, and therefore I think we will see more convergence in the future, but just right now, probably most countries have not yet laid all their cards on the table. And yes, I will leave it there for the moment, and we'll talk about different strategies later. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Frederick. Over to Irma.
Thank you so much, Martin. And thank you everyone for being here. I haven't said a word, but welcome everyone and thank you for being here. When we look at the terms of reference, and when normally we discuss the terms of reference, this kind of an assignment. And this assignment says the what, the how, and the who. And one of these questions that I have is to what extent you have a terms of reference, even if it's a zero draft, a terms of reference that is clear enough to find out what is the what, the who, and the how. And my problem with this is, and I'm very critical about these terms of reference, because if we start with a broader perspective, we may not end up with what we really want. And when we start talking, for instance, about the what, we say about a lot of principles, but what do those principles mean? Do these principles have a meaning? And this fairness, equitable, and so forth, these principles that are being mentioned, even though are important for the countries, we may not have an agreement on what does it mean. And that already creates a lot of problems in terms of what the countries think of fairness is. For instance, of equitable, or transparent, of efficient, of effective. And even for economists, for lawyers, for politicians, all of those have different meanings. The second part, what I think that we are missing a little the point is in the difference on the substantive elements. Because why we need to discuss exchange of information and administrative assistance? Why? We already have, from the Article 26, from the Model Convention, from the OECD and the UN, And we already have the multilateral convention on administrative assistance. We already have a lot of standards, the exchange of information on request, the automatic exchange of information. So why we need to discuss transparency and exchange of information? What we need to do in that sense is to review again the Article 26 of the OECD and the UN model and look whether we align with what we have right now on exchange of information and what the Article 26 is about. For instance, we are doing a research for the Dutch government on foreseeable relevance. What is already different when we look at the amount of exchange of information and how automatic and the use of digital technologies will change the foreseeable relevance. So why we need to include this in the terms of reference? The second part that I have is we already know that prevention of dispute resolution, prevention of disputes is a kind of a broader topic that even within the Action 14 has not been able to deal with, because there is a lot of countries that still are struggling to find this kind of system to solve disputes. So why we need to have it there? We already have last week a tax certainty meeting. We already have the whole discussion on Action 14. So why we need to have it in these terms of reference? What I do think that is important is in these substantive elements to focus on the corporate taxation, allocation of taxing rights, make use of also the changes that were made to the UN Convention on digital services, for instance, and at the same time to discuss the taxation of wealth individuals. But the other part of administrative cooperation is very difficult for me to understand why we need to put it in these terms of reference. Are we trying to distract the real message? What is what we want to achieve? But then when we talk about the who are the actors? And I think that Frederick was very comprehensive, and also Claudia, regarding what the countries are doing. So we have regions, we have rotation system, we have the discussion how the voting will take place. But the question is also, we cannot forget that when we bring the discussions to the UN level, then we will not only have tax people, experts, but we also have foreign affairs, other type of experts on the UN level. So the same happens with the WTO. When you go to the WTO meetings, you do have the representative of the WTO that it may not be even a tax lawyer, but they are still discussing about, for instance, the e-commerce moratorium. May not be a trade lawyer, they are still discussing about e-commerce. So the question is, who are the ones who are representing here, and the actors and the countries, and how this rotation system will make sure that all the countries and differences being heard, as we also understand from the discussion of the countries. So this is a challenge, and I really welcome the UN, but also the OECD countries and all the participants and the countries to think about how we can solve this problem. But then the final part that I have is that we did say in the first report about the global tax governance, about legitimacy, and so forth. But we are not really saying anything about the process. And remember, it's terms of reference. When you get an assignment, you really say, this is what we are going to do, and this is how we are going to do it. And even though the inputs that have been provided are being published at the UN website, still there is a lot of things need to be done in terms of transparency, inclusiveness, accountability, and openness. And then in this sense, we have to see how the system of governance will work with the UN. So these are some of my thoughts that I also put it in the input statement that I submitted, because I was triggered. At principle, I wasn't sure whether I was going to do it, because there is a lot of things to be say about this, but I wasn't sure whether we are still missing the context, and we are going to discuss 2-3 years all the same. Just focus on what is important, and let's try to get something done. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Irma. And our final speaker in the panel speaking section is Peter Hongler. While Peter is speaking, just to say, we have lots of illustrious participants who are not listed to speak, but we have time for a discussion afterwards. So if you want to contribute to the discussion, you can type a message in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can have a brief speaker queue after this. Okay, over to Peter.
Thank you, Martin. I will be very short, so because it's important to have the open debate here. I could not agree more with Irma. Personally, I believe that the focus now should really be on the structural part of the framework convention or the terms of reference, because if we don't have the framework in place, we won't have any results out of it that are different to the current setting of international tax governments. So the focus should really be on the structural elements. Now, what are the structural elements? First of all, we need to have a secretariat, yes, and we need to have a body where, you know, the members of the Framework Convention can meet. And we need potentially also to have a dispute settlement body that, you know, can help to solve disputes among countries, because the current, you know, environment of review processes, of a global forum, of an inclusive framework, without disclosing really who decides on what kind of matters, I think has strong weaknesses that can be overcome by a framework convention that outlines, you know, clear rules on who is competent to do what, and is there someone who controls what countries are actually doing. Second comment here, again, the focus should be on the lowest common denominator, because otherwise the project will fail. And personally, I strongly believe that we will not find a solution, for instance, on taxation of the digital economy within this process here. We will not find a solution on wealth taxation within the process here. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I just strongly believe that this is not going to work. So the focus should really be on the lowest common denominator. And I think there we do have a lot of opportunities to, you know, create a structure that is more legitimate than the current international policy making in tax matters. Last comment on the protocols. I think the protocols are a key element here, and I really appreciate what, you know, the drafters have done, that they have thought, let's relieve the Framework Convention a bit by putting things into protocols. But I would add there that these protocols, they don't need to be signed by all members to the Framework Convention, but these protocols can be signed by subgroups of the Framework Convention. I give you a few examples. We could have a protocol on harmful tax regimes. Yes, so countries can sign that protocol on harmful tax regime. Second of all, we could have a protocol on the taxation of the digital economy, be it a digital PE or be it a harmonized DST solution, whatever. And that protocol, again, can be signed by a subgroup of the Framework Convention. Even the MCAA, so the Mutual Convention on Administrative Assistance, could be a protocol to the Framework Convention. So I see a lot of room linking the Framework Convention both to existing agreements among subgroups, but also in the future that subgroups to the Framework Convention can sign additional agreements. And I think that will be the key to success, because we need less global tax policy in the sense that we all need to agree, but we need to have a system in place that allows the international tax regime to develop in a more inclusive and fair and cooperative manner. Martin, that's already it from my side. So I think we have 20 minutes left for questions and debates. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Peter. Okay, so the floor is open. I'm keen that we don't think of this as questions to the panelists, but rather contributions. If you have something that's addressed to as a question, that's fine, but equally very welcome just to make a point. I will monitor for hands to go up in the chat. So we'll just have an awkward pause for a moment to see whose hands come up. Okay, so over to Jimena Garcia.
Hi, Martin. Hi, everyone. I hope you can listen to me okay. Is this working?
That's great. Thank you. Yes. Can you introduce yourself before speaking?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, my camera is not currently working. I'm Jimena Garcia. I'm currently an associate to the IBFD, to the Knowledge Center. This has been very interesting, and I have a question, and it's been rounding my mind since I've been reading the zero terms of reference, and since this process started last year. So in the case that we have several protocols, we start having like multiple protocols to the Framework Convention. How does that operate in terms of of a convention. And maybe this is just a question regarding international public law, but are we even able to have multiple protocols if the framework convention is not fully decided or debated? I don't know if I'm being clear, but that would be the question.
Thanks, Jimena. I see Peter has got his hand up, so maybe he wants to answer. I think it might be easiest if the panelists, if you want to reply to any of the comments raised, if you raised your hand in Zoom, and then I can call on you. Okay, so I have Peter and Claudia both coming in on this point.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a very important question. And if you look to other fields of international public law, such as international trade law, what they use is so-called plurilateral agreements. So these protocols, as I understand them, they could be plurilateral agreements. Now, plurilateral agreements are, again, agreements among a subgroup of a framework convention, or at the WTO, among a subgroup of WTO members. And I really believe that this is the way forward, that, you know, by putting things into the protocol, we are not endangering the framework convention, but at the same time, we, you know, create an opportunity for coalitions among the willing, you know, countries that want to proceed in certain areas. Why not? So they should go forward, but in an institutionalized manner. So I really believe that the protocols create a huge opportunity for success, but they should be understood as plurilateral agreements among subgroups of the framework convention. But probably Claudia corrects me that this was not the idea by using protocols. Thank you.
Claudia?
Thank you. Yes, well, it's very important to have this question, because as it is a framework convention, the idea is, or the purpose of it is not to address substantive issues completely, in a complete manner. As Peter was saying, this will allow to have like a forum, a space, as its name is, a framework for countries to come and discuss not only what has been mentioned in the resolution or what will be mentioned or included in the terms of reference, but to discuss other issues further in time. And these protocols, even if we discuss about early protocols, as Jimena mentioned, they can't come alive until there is a convention signed by the countries. And therefore, the first, and it happens with other multilateral conventions in other matters, as far as I remember, not regarding taxes, but regarding other issues, countries will have to sign and ratify the convention before being able to sign and ratify the protocols. And not all countries, or as far as we have seen, we don't know what's going to happen, how the terms of reference will look like at the end of the day, and what the General Assembly will approve. But in general, what could happen or should happen is that being part of the convention does not imply that you will have to agree and ratify on all protocols, which is, I think, a bit tricky, because depending on the tax matter to be addressed by the protocol, it would be important to have everybody on board. And if you don't have enough countries or enough members in a protocol, it may be not as efficient as it should. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claudia. So I have Frederick and Philip Baker. I have a few people in the queue now, and to say I've had a couple of messages in the chat as well. So let's just close up on this topic first. So Frederick, I think you're coming back on this topic.
Yeah, it's just a brief remark. So also coming back to what Peter said about it, I think from the beginning, my understanding at least has always been that this is the idea, that protocols won't have to be signed by anybody, But yeah, also reading submissions from countries, there still seems to be some confusions about it. So it's probably something important to clarify in the TOR. But I just thought there's a famous like historical example. It's in the climate change regime where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed by a lot of states, but for example, the Kyoto Protocol was not signed by the United States. So like there are, I think, probably many precedents of this.
Okay, thanks, Frederick. Okay, Philip was next. I'm not sure if he's replying on this or has a new question, but either way, over to Philip.
Hello, Martin. Hello, everybody. I think I know most people on the screen. I'm Philip Baker. I'm visiting professor at Oxford University. Just on this particular point of protocols, very briefly, it's not at all uncommon to have multilateral conventions where there are optional protocols that some members join and some don't. If you look, for example, in the human rights area, the European Convention on Human Rights has about 16 protocols, and not every country has signed up to all of the protocols. The UK, for example, has never signed up to the 4th protocol, for example, if I remember rightly. It's not at all unusual. What is an interesting question is whether countries will be able to sign up to protocols assuming the framework goes ahead and everything, but if they'll be able to sign up to protocols without being members of the framework convention itself, because it may be that there will be some countries that reject the framework convention, but nevertheless, when a protocol comes along, says, oh, that's not a bad idea, and we'll go along with that. That would be a little bit peculiar, but it depends a little bit on the formation or how the protocols are actually drafted as to whether that be possible. I wanted to make 3 comments, and they're all ones that you probably were expecting me to make, Martin. Why shouldn't I be predictable and boring there? But 3 comments about the, well, I've got lots of comments about the terms of reference, but 3 particular ones. One of them is, as some of you would have already heard me saying, I was a bit shocked to find that in the earlier discussions about the in the first session of the ad hoc committee, no country emphasized that one of the principles for a UN convention in this area has to be respect for and advancement of human rights. I noticed that in the input statement, some countries have picked that up, as has the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I noticed that the Zero Draft makes some references to fundamental freedoms. 2 points on that. Firstly, it's inconceivable that a UN multilateral convention in this area will not be making reference to one of the objects of the UN in the UN Charter, Article 1, which is the protection and advancement of human rights. And I think that should be taken as read, that that has to be put in as one of the principles. Secondly, there's been some discussion about the fact that the right to privacy was explicitly mentioned. I think that's a bit of a mistake. The right to privacy is one of a number of fundamental rights, and I don't see any particular reason why that should be singled out from any other there. So that seems to me to be, it's an unfortunate legacy of the dominance of the OECD in this area, that human rights doesn't get sufficient attention, and it has to be in a UN body. 2 other comments very briefly. One of them is, it's not perhaps a matter for the Zero Draft, but it does seem to me that there has to be some discussion in the sessions in New York about the success criteria for the framework convention. If there is to be a framework convention, is it going to be a success if only 70% of the world signs up to it? Or should one be looking for as many countries, maybe entire UN -1, to join? There has to be some idea of what is a success criteria. And finally, there also ought to be some discussion of, are there alternative fallback plans if the framework convention cannot be agreed or cannot be agreed in time? and some of you will know that I've suggested that a very easy way of getting work going in this area, and as a fallback, would be to get ECOSOC to revive the old fiscal commission that existed up to 1954. That simply needs an ECOSOC resolution to get it going, and that could start doing some of the work, the preparatory work for some of the protocols, which is so essential. But many of you have heard me saying those things before, but why not be predictable and boring? Thanks, Martin.
Thanks very much, Philip. What I'm going to do is try and collect a few more comments from people, and then we might give a last word to panelists. So I'm not going to put those comments directly to anybody immediately. Over to Veronica Grondona.
Hi. Well, first, thanks for the organization of this event. Actually, it's so far everything which I heard has been very useful for my understanding of what we are discussing in the Framework Convention and the terms of reference. So one question that I had, I mean, from what Peter was saying, I'm a bit more confused than I was before. My background is not a lawyer. I'm an economist, and I'm trying to understand the part of the negotiation in here. So I see some countries are trying to actually, or some countries have and the comments to the zero draft or the inputs to the zero draft, they mentioned that the discussion at this point should not be on the substantive elements, but should be only on procedures, and that the terms of reference should actually discuss only procedures and no substantive elements at all. While other countries, and I'm talking about two extremes, I don't know if I want to enter into which countries have mentioned this, but another particular country which I'm thinking about goes to the other extreme and says, well, the terms of reference should actually only discuss substantive elements, and we don't need to discuss at this point the procedure, because that's going to be discussed at the General Assembly. And so I'm and from what the discussion has been so far in this event, I'm still a bit confused on that, because I understand, the protocols and discussions we were having before, but doesn't the topics that are going to be, or the big themes or topics that are going to be included in the protocols, don't they need to be somehow included as substantive elements of the convention in order to actually be able to have those protocols afterwards? And so that's kind of my discussion. What's the level of inclusion of these substantive elements that we need to have in the terms of reference in order to be able to afterwards go into detail in the protocols? So I'm sorry, and one other comment on the human rights, on the comment that was made before on human rights aspects. Actually, I saw that at least one country from South America mentioning that the inclusion of fundamental human rights aspects and principles should be in the preamble, as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. So I also see, well, that's being taken by some countries, and I also see that's important also for the way in which this convention is going to be taken up afterwards into the constitution, or in some countries at least, that would affect the way in which it's going to be introduced or considered in the legal framework of particular countries. I understand also. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So as we have 3 hours, we won't necessarily get to direct answers to all these questions, but I think some of them will come up subsequently. What I'm going to do is just go to a couple of comments from the chat, and then open it up to see if any of the panelists want to come back on anything. So I had a question sent directly to me from Lucky Star Miandazi at the African Union Commission. She's asking, when Irma and Peter, when you referred to the lowest common denominator, what was it that you meant specifically in that context? And I'm assuming what you were meaning was along the lines of finding the things which are which everybody can agree with, which are therefore less contentious and a less strong form of outcome for those who have strong ambitions for the convention, but which are more easy to reach consensus around. But I'll leave that for you to respond on. And then we also had Christina Dimitropoulou, who I asked to just come on and read out or speak to the comment that she put in the chat. So if you're there, Christina, this is your moment.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, thank you very much for all your comments and discussion so far. So my question basically refers to the requirement of inclusiveness of the Framework Convention. And my question is actually, what do you think, or what is your impression or idea of how inclusiveness is going to be achieved within the UN? And what do I mean by that? I mean, firstly, that on one hand, the UN is supposed to be more inclusive because it includes more countries as members. And on the other hand, it has more of established processes, so a lot of opportunity there for more countries of different interests to take part and express their opinion. On the other hand, inclusiveness is also a requirement that it's going to be affected by the content. So how do these countries are going to agree at the end of the day is going to, to interpret inclusiveness in one sense. So how all these asymmetric interests and dynamics of the countries that Claudia also mentioned, that there are a lot of different interests among the regions. How are all these going to be, compromised within the UN, and whether at the end of the day that could be a success story? And as Philip said, whether it will just, it's going to be just a numerical exercise of inclusiveness, or it is something more that we should aim for. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christina. Okay, so Frederick and I have agreed that we'll take an extra couple of minutes from this on to the end of this session and make the next panel that he's moderating slightly shorter. So that gives us time for the panelists, just anyone who wants to come back on any of the points, to just do so quickly. So if the panelists want to say anything to conclude, then raise your hand. I'll be quite strict about giving you just a minute or two to do so. Claudia, you had your hand up first.
Thank you, Martin. I just want to refer to the last question. I think that's a very important question, and that's something that that we all have been thinking about. In my opinion, and being able and having the opportunity to be in OECD discussions and negotiations and at the UN, I think that inclusiveness does not depend necessarily on the fora of discussion. I have seen that in the inclusive framework, we are more than 140 countries. In the UN, we are 195. And inclusiveness for me, it's not about numbers. It's about the possibility for countries to engage, to have the resources to be to have, for example, for tax administrations, to have the resources, the time to read all the documents, to propose, to sit down and analyze what's been, what are their interests, what are the issues at the table, and to be able to contribute and discuss. So this, in my view, this needs further work. And I really hope that the UN, it's not just an exercise, but the possibility to go to allow the countries to discuss, to bring to the table their views, to be heard, but it needs to be wisely used by every country, because even at the UN, and if you have been following the discussions, being at the UN doesn't mean that every country is participating. So I think it depends more on capabilities. I do believe that every country has a lot to contribute to tax discussions. And let's hope that having this forum will allow to bring more people to the table. But it's more, in my view, it's not only the fora, but also how countries can be involved, can get empowered to discuss and to bring to the table all what they have to give.
Thanks very much, Claudia. Frederick.
Yeah, also on this question. So of course, the fact that countries have different interests, the switching a fora can never take that away, and that's a given. But I think still that the way a fora works can matter how these different interests are brought to the table and how they can potentially be reconciled. And one important element there, I think, is that it is a different thing when you establish together a fora in which you want to talk about something, or if you join an already established a club, so to say, with its own informal rules, and you have to learn first how to navigate these spaces. And I think that's one of the fundamental differences that the UN can possibly achieve. And yeah, no, that's my point there.
Okay, thanks very much, Frederick. Last word goes to Peter, and I hope, Peter, you can pick up the point about lowest common denominator.
Yes. So on the lowest common denominator, what is important to understand, I think, that we need to understand that the current problems are not the problems that we are going to solve in the future. So we need to create a framework that is able to solve the problems of the future. So if we look at the international tax regime, in the early 2000s, it was cross-border tax evasion. Then it was aggressive tax planning by multinationals. Now it moves into the taxation of individuals. So in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, we will have completely different questions to solve. And I think now it's the moment to, finally agree on a framework, and the framework should be, should have as many countries on board as possible. And that's the lowest common denominator. Imagine for a second that in the 20s, they did not agree on a model convention, but they asked some political scientists to come up with a framework of governing the international tax regime. I think we would live in a completely different world, to be honest. And I think we need to do the work now to create a framework on how to solve the policy questions of the future. And this is why I'm always emphasizing the lowest common denominator. I think it should not be on the substantive part now, but on the, really on the structural questions, because that will enable us really to advance in international tax law. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And thanks to everybody there, for the panelists and the audience for your questions. But some of the comments that didn't get replies, I think we'll leave hanging in the air and may revisit later in this 3-hour session. So I'm going to hand over now to Frederick, who's going to be moderating the next panel.
Thank you very much, Martin. And I think it's a smooth transition, because the million-dollar question that I have the pleasure now to moderate is under which conditions different groups of countries, whether it's OECD or non-OECD countries, would be open to agree on a UN framework tax convention. So yeah, now we'll be talking about what where is it that different interests can come together. And for this panel, we have 4 members again. First, we're going to hear from Suranjali Tandon, who is an associate professor at the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy in India. We're going to have Martin, who we already know from the last panel. We have as well Bakizo Mbagwape, who is also my colleague at the International Center for Tax and Development, and who has previously collected experience also in the area of trade, working as a government official for Botswana. And we're going to hear from Peter Hongla, who has been introduced already. So Suranjali, if you don't mind to start to kick off this discussion.
Thanks, Frederick. So as I see that the international tax system was fragmented or is fragmented because there are different interests, and Frederick did mention that this is not going, you cannot wish it away. There are going to be different economic interests, and so therefore the expectations even from this new framework are expected to diverge. But taking just from the example of climate negotiations, where the UN plays an important role, you have every year a conference of parties, and then you also have a broad sort of framework to work with. There is a protocol which is signed by countries, and I think for countries to come and agree and sit on the table in a different forum now really depends on what is the principle that is going to guide countries come and work together. So, for example, if you look at the draft, it talks about the UN SDGs. Now, is this one of the guiding principles to talk about illicit financial flows or domestic resource mobilization, as well as the other points mentioned within it? So, I think one is to have an overarching sort of common agreement on what is going to be the purpose. The second, I think, is on representation. Enough has been written about the lack of transparency in negotiations or in discussions at the inclusive framework at the OECD, and I think what the UN offers as an alternative is a step up from there to say that there will be transparency available on the discussions that took place and the drafts that were released. So, for example, if you look at the negotiations under the UNFCCC, they're not all available in the public domain, but it gives you a point of reference on what happened iteratively to the draft when different member countries they did not agree on specific aspects and words within the text, and that gives you a sense of where different countries stand. And I think that will be extremely critical for developing countries to come and participate at a new forum. I think that's true even for developed countries. I think the third important aspect which needs to be addressed is how is this funded? So what are the resources available? So for example, if you go back to the draft, there's a mention on resources to support the work of the negotiating body, wherein it's also to be ensured that the relevant stakeholders and member states are in a position to participate, and they encourage developing countries to participate. So will these resources and capacity building really be available, or are we going to be again in the situation where it is like the inclusive framework, where there's not enough capacity built among participants? There is still a resource constraint on participation. I think that needs to be addressed if this forum is over and above what the OECD has already done. And I think it's also important to remember that there are institutional frameworks that the OECD has already worked on. So, for example, if you talk about the automatic exchange of information, the peer review process on harmful tax regimes, they already exist, and countries have been using them. So I think the neat sort of bifurcation of where OECD can continue to remain relevant and the work can sort of plug in with what the UN is doing is absolutely essential, because if this clarity is lost, then it could be that developed countries that put their weight behind OECD may find it less interesting to be at the United Nations. So I think those are 4 points which I think are quite important to get developed and developing countries to come and participate in the new forum. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Suranjali, for raising some interesting points about some open issues and also about how past experience that can maybe show how difficult situations can be overcome. Next on my list, I have Martin. Please, Martin, do you have some slides to share? Or...
No, in the end, no. So I decided to spare everyone the slides. So no, I just want to make a couple of points about this. So the kind of the framing of this panel is under what conditions would countries OECD and non-OECD be open to agree on the convention? As we've already talked about, and I think we can to some extent set aside, you have the convention, which needs to be as big a tent as possible. And then you have the protocols within it, which can vary in how much they meet this quote unquote lowest common denominator approach, and to what extent some of them are more deeper, more ambitious, and therefore fewer countries will be willing to agree to. I think if we take that as our starting point, and our question right now is under what conditions will countries join the overarching framework convention? I think there's a few points to make about that. And I want to start just by observing some of the key flashpoints that you could see in the negotiations last time round on the terms of reference. Well, they weren't negotiations, the initial talks of the ad hoc committee that we could observe. One of the key flashpoints was around decision making. The OECD countries were very insistent on wanting to have consensus decision making as far as possible. Many of the other countries were insistent on wanting to have majority decision making. It feels like that's an issue on which there is a pathway towards reaching a kind of agreement, in the sense of you try very hard for a majority, for a consensus, but if you can't, then you fall back on a majority. And that's actually something which, in practice, there's not a binary distinction between organizations that take decisions by majority and organizations that work by consensus, because most organizations do some variation along those lines, with a stronger or weaker attempt to reach consensus first. The second point was around this language of complementarity versus consolidation. So the OECD countries were keen to emphasize that there should be complementarity between what's already been produced at the OECD and between what's produced at the UN, and I think underlying that was a concern to safeguard the position. I think both the work that has already been done by the OECD, but also the position of the OECD as the lead organization for those areas of work. And so complementarity was used as a framing to argue that what takes place at the UN should be work which hasn't already been done at the OECD. Whereas for example, the African Union bloc, the language of consolidation was really around saying the work that has been at the OECD shouldn't be thrown out, but it should be subsumed within what takes place at the OECD, at the UN convention. And let me say that my view is that this is an area where it's going to be much harder to reach any kind of consensus view, because I think I find it very hard to imagine a world in which the OECD countries are willing to relinquish the position of the OECD on the areas that it currently is the leading organization. I think that we may need to look for a different pathway towards articulating the role of the UN Convention in respect of those areas, if the intention is to frame the convention in a way that the OECD countries themselves are willing to join. But I'd be really interested to hear what other people think about that point. And the third kind of key flashpoint was around sequencing. So the extent to which the convention should, the convention negotiations should already look into the substantive content around the protocols, and the extent to which they should, you should first of all agree the convention and then work on the protocols. And it seems that again, a compromise has kind of it's possible to work out a compromise here. There's slight different views on how it would work. The UK put forward a compromise proposal, although I noticed that in the framing of the UK submission, I think they've slightly changed the way in which they articulate that. As I understood it in the room in New York, the compromise was that work would begin on protocols in parallel with what was taking place on the convention, but that not all the protocols would need to be resolved at the point the convention was agreed, and final kind of decisions could be taken on them afterwards. Whereas I think now the UK's position is more to say that initial work can be done on the protocols, but the major work of negotiating them should take place after the convention is established. So I think exactly how that working in parallel works is still to be hammered out, but it does feel like there's a landing zone that can be reached there between the different camps. But yeah, but I would say that in spite of that, I think it's important to emphasize here that the decision-making environment is one in which, if we think about the politics here, there's a couple of kind of fairly blunt things that we have to be aware of. The first is, like, unless things change in subsequent rounds of General Assembly negotiations, there's a strong bloc, Global South bloc, which knows what it wants and has a majority. And that's the overriding context in which the talks are taking place. And it's an interesting and new one. But I think that does mean that whenever there is a difference of view about between OECD minority and a majority of other countries, the framing of that disagreement is around, well, how far will the minority push and how much does the majority want to give, given that ultimately the majority can just hold firm and push through what it wants. And I think the choice for the majority in that context is how much are we willing to push and risk the idea that the OECD countries will not join. And I think that's a strategic decision primarily for the Global South to make. I think that they can keep pushing and pushing and pushing and see whether the OECD countries are still willing to join. But ultimately, I think that the impetus is really with them. But then the second kind of point to make about that I think it's really important to clarify is the Global South here, or the non-OECD bloc, is not uniform in any way. That there are differences of approach, differences of negotiating strength. We observe a very strong, well-coordinated African bloc, which is the bloc, the grouping that put forward the resolution in the first place, and which still continues to move in a very strongly coordinated way. Other parts of the world are not so strongly coordinated at this point, and there are different perspectives. You heard in the room different perspectives from different countries. So I think it could be that over time we start to see more slightly different perspectives on some of these contentious questions emerge from different groups of countries. And so I think it will be interesting, like the literature on coalitions often talks about in international negotiations, often talks about as you get closer to the crunch moment of a negotiation, the question is, did the coalition hold firm? And I think one thing we'll have to observe is whether as we get closer to the crunch moments, is there still a clear consensus amongst a majority of countries from the Global South about the things they want to insist on, or does that start to fray a bit? Then the final point I wanted to make is, I think, as a counterbalance to that, like the OECD countries don't really want this convention to be taking place, and we know that because we know the way they voted on the resolution. So the fact that they're still here shows that in terms of the way that the dynamic of the negotiation is taking place, they still want to be at the table, even in a negotiation process they don't really welcome. And so as time goes on, and as characteristics of the convention consolidate, which maybe don't reflect what the OECD countries want, I think they're likely still to be there because they will want to influence the content. I suppose a caveat to that is, well, the US is there, but it's unlikely the US will ratify whatever emerges from this, given the struggles with ratifying stuff from the OECD. And so maybe not all the countries that are in the negotiations are in there are likely to ratify at the end. But nonetheless, the reason, the argument I make in my book from a few years ago is the reason why that OECD countries pursued international tax cooperation with other countries in the global south, was around corporate taxation at least, was primarily to ensure that when their businesses invest outwards, their businesses are taxed in a way which reflects certain norms of how taxation should work, which emerged from the OECD. And I think the strategic question for the OECD countries is, if a convention starts to go in a direction that is less like what they would like to see, is it better to be inside that tent and still trying to shape it, in pursuit of that objective of ensuring that when their investors go outwards, their investors are still taxed in a way that the OECD countries have influenced? Or is it wise to step outside of it and lose the ability to shape that? And so I think that probably actually there's quite a long way in which the Global South bloc, if we can call it that, can push while retaining the involvement of the OECD countries. But I will be really interested to hear others' reflections on that.
Thank you, Martin, for this quite political outlook on these dynamics. We now have Bakizo Magwape as our next speaker, and also the last speaker of our panel, correct myself. So Peter has already made his remarks earlier, so Bakizo will be the last speaker, and then we have a round for further comments from everyone in the audience. Bakizo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Frederick, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to today's discussion. My bandwidth is acting up a little bit, so please do let me know if it's a bit choppy. So I just switch off my camera. So I think there are a number of critical areas we have to examine, which really are battlegrounds or areas where you might get a bit of push and pull from developed and developing countries. And I'm going to point to history and start in 2015, where the real push and emergence of setting an intergovernmental organization came from at the Addis Ababa Financing for Sustainable Development conference. Now, the primary issue there, interesting enough, was that European civil society organizations with developing countries sought to set up an intergovernmental body on the basis that they believed that the regime was not inclusive enough, but more importantly, that issues such as source residence, taxing rights were not addressed, and where over the years the regime wasn't equitable. So it's all about equity. And if you actually read the language of the current zero draft, it carries on some of that language and it even references that Addis Ababa session. And if you look at paragraph 10, it talks about fair allocation of taxing rights, and it's in brackets. So clearly, this is something which isn't really solidified. And I'm talking about paragraph 10 of the current zero draft, by the way. And if you look at paragraph 7C of the zero draft, it also talks about establishing an inclusive, fair, transparent, efficient, and equitable international tax system. So the issue of equitability and the issue of fair allocation of taxing rights is the primary reason why the African bloc and developing countries have pushed for an intergovernmental organization, which effectively should be able to address that particular key issue. Now, the main issue, which I would like to also reference and refer to, is if you look at the OECD and we talk about addressing taxing rights, the feel was that this wasn't done adequately under the OECD. So the main real issue really is from this particular point in time, before we even get to the substance of the actual framework convention, that at this particular point in time, while we're at terms of reference, will the issue of fair allocation of taxing rights be incorporated and make it, and how much pushback will there be at this particular point in time? And even when we do talk about that, the main issue really is the pushback from developed countries. Is we can see that the real issue is how far will developing countries deviate or seek to deviate from normative rules, or alternatively international tax standards, which have already been developed under the auspices of the OECD. And I'll give you a simple example. When we look at the sixth method, which effectively is a deviation from your traditional transfer pricing rules under the OECD, and how much push developing countries had to make in order to finally have the sixth method recognized, we can see that already the battlegrounds in terms of trying to incorporate certain aspects, but this is not purely about source residence taxing rights. This is just deviating from international tax standards and, let's say, normative rules. So the main issue is how far will at this point in time, will developing countries be allowed to be able to set certain preferences, and developed countries agree to those issues. Now, I just want to move on to another issue, which also is raised in the convention, and which is also going to be a bit of a sticky issue between developing and developed countries. And I anticipate that special and differential treatment will be an issue. And Suranjali mentioned one of the issues regarding special and differential treatment, which effectively is financing. If countries are saying, in order for us to effectively participate, we need financial assistance and we need technical assistance, the question is, who finances it? And more importantly, another spin on this is, which are the eligible countries for this? Which are the eligible countries for special and differential treatment? And I'm going to reference the WTO and the challenges they have had in SNDT. And the main issue is theirs is a self-assessing type of system, or self-notification system, where they say, we are a developing country and we require SNDT, and therefore they are eligible for it. There is no set criteria other than LDCs, of course, which could also be referenced as low income countries with the World Bank indice of what a LIC is. But other developing countries can notify and say, we're a developing country, therefore we require preferences to be able to receive that. So the big sticky issue is, yes, of course, right now we're at the formative stages in setting the terms of reference. But if you have countries like right now, China is regarded as a developing country, but if you have countries which set their own criteria, that will automatically result in the preference-giving countries, such as, let's say, OECD countries, being reluctant to be able to provide the nature of assistance. So establishing a criteria on that is going to be extremely pivotal in order to be able to account to the different needs, priorities, capacities of the particular countries and their special situations. And then just on the procedural issues, Martin touched on it, Peter touched on it, so I really don't want to belabor the point. But when we're dealing with decision-making and the issue of consensus, the main issue I wanted to touch on here isn't just the politics between consensus and the level of thresholds which voting would bring, which effectively is the alternative to consensus. But I just want to touch on just plurilateral agreements and how they also function in the WTO and the challenges which I foresee in this particular environment between developed and developing countries. Some plurilateral agreements in certain organizations require consensus themselves. So despite the fact that with plurilateral agreements, they don't apply to all countries, and countries can decide whether to adopt, especially if they affect them, and some can opt out effectively. That's the nature of plurilateral agreements, that you can opt out. The challenge that the WTO currently faces is that they require consensus. So I'm going to give the example of the agreement on investment. And under the WTO, 128 countries agreed. South Africa and India, only 2 countries withheld on consensus out of disgruntlement with previous issues, let's say under TRIPS and the vaccine-related issues. And when they withheld, that means consensus wasn't able to be reached. So you've got plurilateral agreements which should be able to address specific individual needs, which are still being held by a consensus system. So even though we might think that plurilateral agreements might be the solution, the ticket to resolving key issues and individual issues, if the issue of voting and the thresholds and whether to opt for the consensus, of course, thresholds isn't resolved, dare I say, even at an reasonably early stage, then this whole negotiation and the framework convention itself, I believe, might run the risk of potentially being at risk of not being able to effectively operate. So all of those issues, I mean, and WTO has been grappling with these issues for years. And so getting those issues right in the beginning, or having some form of agreement, even if it means that certain rules operate by consensus, maybe the core rules, and then other rules have different levels of thresholds, that might be the potential solution. But unfortunately, as the other speakers had mentioned, at this stage, procedural rules with regards to rulemaking, decision-making, are pretty much absent. So unfortunately, the skeleton might have to be, we might have to put flesh on the skeleton a bit early on of procedure in order to ensure that the negotiations and the actual convention sees the light of day. Thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you very much, Makiso, especially for bringing these important insights from the WTO regime in how does it work there with lateral agreements and with special and differential treatment. So now that we might see both in the international tax regime. We still have around 25 minutes for debate. So any comment or question by anyone in the audience is very welcome. And or in the chat. I already see one hand. So over to you, Kyang Chai. Hi.
Thank you very much for the speakers. So one thing that struck my mind is that perhaps first and foremost, what would be the scope of the Framework Convention, because it might affect the level of consensus. So are we going to still limiting ourselves to double taxation or double non-taxation, or are we going to kind of create substantive standards for national tax laws? That traditionally, conventionally, we say that international tax law is really about the interface between national tax laws. We don't judge national tax law, but still people are talking about the climate change, development, human rights. So what are we going to do? Is it just still about the traditional framework, about the avoidance of double taxation, double non-taxation, but then try to incorporate those values into this framework? So, for example, emphasis of the source jurisdiction, or are we going to, like the investment law or trade law, to create some standards for national legal system, tax system? I mean, if it is still traditional framework, we are. I think probably we're kind of duplicating what OECD has already done, and probably we need a stronger case. We can't just say, UN is kind of a more representative, and it's probably not the case today because OECD is also very smarter, but is already in partnership with G20. Is what I mean. On the other hand, if we're going to kind of governing the national tax system, then I would say this is a real opportunity for the UN take the leadership. And probably OECD would be happy to follow that kind of a leadership because it's never been the scope for OECD. I think Peter previously mentioned this kind of a competition. But on the other hand, I guess it might be too ambitious, there'll be too many things. So yeah, this is my question about the scope of the framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important question. And just before giving it to the floor, can I remind everybody who takes the floor for the first time to just briefly introduce themselves? That would be great. Maybe waiting for more comments. Would somebody of the floor like to respond on this? Somebody from the panel? Perhaps it's a good moment to also bring in another question that was posted in the chat just at the moment of transition between the panels, where Lakista Miyandari asked what international tax issues would actually constitute a lowest common denominator, and whether this would not mean removing most of the substantive issues that developing countries want to see. Suranjali, you've
Yeah, Frederick, I just wanted to quickly comment on the question. To my mind, looking at the draft, I think the scope of the UN framework is a bit beyond what we would imagine, what is already sort of imagined as the common denominator under the OECD. So it takes the agenda forward because it has many other issues such as illicit financial flows, domestic resource mobilization, and high net worth individuals in the list. In terms of whether we can do this, whether we can think of domestic tax systems under a multilateral forum, it's a big question because the OECD has tried this before. So you had the issues of tax base and tax incentives being dealt with, and the work sort of fell by the wayside, and it wasn't very prescriptive. So I think that needs to be thought through while thinking about the UN framework. And just to say what we might use as a common goal, the OECD has managed to get countries to agree on a minimum tax, and I think and there's obviously a discussion under the G20 presidency this year on a minimum tax on high net worth individuals, and I think that is a common standard that countries have explicitly agreed to. So can the UN framework really start with that as a common goal to achieve through tax policy? Thank you.
Thank you, Suranjali. Peter, please.
Yes, two comments on the scope. I think that's exactly what is still in debate, right? and we have major opposing positions here. So one position would really be to focus on the framework element here, so to create a new institutional framework for international tax policy making. And the other approach would be to focus on different substantive elements, and I think that has not been solved so far. Now, what Lucky was mentioning in the chat, yes, focusing on the lowest common denominator would mean that most substantive elements would be out, and that is disappointing. But if you compare it to the current international tax world, I think it improves the situation, because you would have a framework under which certain coalitions of the willing, and I was very much appreciating what Martin was saying about coalitions, that coalitions among the willing can actually come up with new agreements. For instance, focusing on the digitalized economy, because currently that is basically impossible. I mean, at the end, if you don't have the OECD countries on board, it's impossible to come up with new ideas, right? With new negotiation frameworks on certain topics. And I think a global framework convention would allow that other countries, beyond OECD member countries, can come up with new agreements among subgroups, subgroups of the framework convention. And therefore, yes, I agree. It sounds disappointing at first glance, but I think on the long run, a framework convention still has a lot of disadvantage for the countries that are currently not heard.
Thank you, Peter. And Martin, before I give the word to you, let me just read also another question from the chat. Maybe you want to pick up on this one as well. It's Kumiko Tsuda, a researcher from Japan, asks how we can describe the interrelationship, if any, between the UN Framework Tax Convention and the Financing for Development agenda. For example, if the UN tax negotiations may affect leverage at this Financing for Development conference, which takes place next year.
Thanks, Frederick. So
over to you, Martin.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to comment a bit on this question around scope and some of the remarks that were just made around it. Like, I think my impression is if you look at the list of issues that have been raised, so the potential protocols, the issues that the convention will deal with, they're at the level of what are some important tax issues. There was a long discussion in New York around the importance of domestic resource mobilization, where everyone could agree that this is an important subject. But then when it came to defining it, it became clear that there was a very different viewpoint of what was meant by saying that an objective of the convention should be to support domestic resource mobilization. Because for some people in the room, that was very much about saying it should be about countries helping each other to do things that are primarily about their domestic tax system. And for others in the room, there was a reluctance to emphasize that point and a desire to focus on the areas in which it is more about the interface between countries' tax systems. So I don't think my impression is, and it would be I don't know if Claudia can tell us anything about how this feels inside the Bureau discussions, but I don't get a sense that there is a very strong, clear view around substantively what is this convention going to deliver in terms of the immediate policy outcomes, like a strong consensus on that, and without having that clearly there. So, for example, on illicit financial flows, what would a UN convention do that the existing apparatus doesn't already do? And absent that, I think it's hard for us to say whether what's in people's minds when they raise these topics is limited to the existing scope of what we understand to be the boundary of what states cooperate on, or whether it does involve an extension of that scope into other areas. I certainly think that the convention will not focus purely on the kind of classic topics of corporate taxation and exchange of information and mutual assistance. I think it will go beyond that if you look at the list of topics that have been discussed into areas such as environmental taxation, which have not until recently become the subject of international cooperation. So I think it will push the boundaries in that areas. But I do think that it's at present, I don't think that there is at all a common view around what the substantive scope should be. And there's probably a project of keeping that as vague as possible in terms of the convention itself, so that can be worked out in the protocols. In terms of the question about the financing for development agenda, obviously historically, the debate around the UN's role in global tax cooperation has very much been part of the financing for development conferences. The third financing for development conference a decade ago reached a stalemate over the question of the role of the UN in global tax cooperation, and eventually there was a compromise brokered and largely a climb down by the African group that had been advocating for some strong wording about this in the outcome. So we would have, I think, until recently anticipated that the fourth financing for development conference would similarly have a very strong emphasis on or a very strong bit of negotiation around the tax agenda. I think what's going to happen now is because we have this process taking place through the General Assembly, I think the financing for development track is probably, it's going to take the heat out of this inside the financing for development track, because while there'll no doubt be some wording, it seems a bit hard to imagine a kind of a separate negotiation taking place around this within the FFD process when there's a separate process for that. So that's my instinct, is that on this occasion, what's happening through the ad hoc committee and the sequence of General Assembly resolutions on this will largely mean that this isn't a major issue in the financing for development negotiations.
Thank you very much, Martin. I don't see many hands raised. I just see one question in the chat, which seems relatively, which is about dispute resolution. Let me read it. I feel that one of the successful factors of WTO is its dispute resolution mechanism. I'm not sure how the framework addresses the accessibility of tax dispute resolution of developing countries and how to improve the current situation of incomplete relief of double taxation. or maybe complete relief is impossible to achieve. That's a question by Ki Wang. And before we go to the last round, in which people maybe want to react, the panelists can react on this question or on other matters. I wanted to throw in one other question, the question of the funding. So Suranjali, you mentioned it. I've been surprised a bit over the last month that this has not yet really come up. If you read the TOR, there's just a reference at the end to request the Secretary General to provide the relevant funding for conducting these negotiations. But I imagine that at one point there will be a question about how do we fund the development of protocols? How do we fund other potential mechanisms that come out of there? So I would be curious to hear if anybody has views about how do you think that an agreement can be reached on this question? Would countries that have a lot of financial resources, would they be willing to provide these, or will that be a controversy? Okay, so yeah, if anybody of the panelists want to answer any of these questions or say some last few words, then yeah, please do so.
So Frederick, maybe I'll, since you raised the point about funding, I think it's important that the framework has clearly defined rights and obligations, which is what we've seen under climate protocols, for example. They may be sort of broadly and vaguely defined in terms of, differentiating countries based on the level of development and who should be the recipients of finance and technical assistance and who should be the providers. But I think it needs to be specified therein. It could be a creation of a common pool, which could fund countries based on needs. And I think that could be agreed through conference of parties that is hosted, annually or whatever the periodicity of the convening may be. So that's my thought.
Thank you. Makizu, yeah.
Yeah, but just mine is a slightly diverging point, but related to the one you just raised. If you look at other structures, such as how the WTO carries out certain functions like technical assistance, they've got a committee which comprises of participants from developing and developed countries alike, and specific requests come into it and they provide assistance from there, which is also an effective way of undertaking technical assistance on key areas which are of interest to developing countries. So I'd just like to say that that's not necessarily a solution to financing, but it is if the UN Secretariat would be able to have a body within, or let's say within the Framework Convention committee, which is able to render that, then that would be a way of effectively at least rendering technical assistance, which is specific to the needs which are identified. And I just want to also, when I say specific to the needs, the difference is under the current regime of the OECD, most technical assistance which is rendered is in reference to standards they've already developed. So example, implementing transfer pricing standards, or let's say assistance with the BEPS action plan, let's say if they require some form of compliance. It's in relation to standards which countries may not even necessarily agree on or have fully implemented or want to implement. So that's the big difference that in terms of how that alternative proposal could work.
Thanks, Makizu. Okay. I don't see further comments right now, so I would suggest that we close this session 10 minutes early and start the next session 10 minutes early as well. So we have the break program now, which I think is a good moment after 2 hours of intense discussion. So we just go back to the last session at 10 past the hour in 10 past 3 in Central Europe, and 10 past another hour somewhere else. Or 22 in some regions.
Yeah, I was going to say 22 in
India. Yeah.
Yes, so we are 10 minutes past the hour, 22 minutes in India, perhaps, as Frederick mentioned. So this is the final session, and this is what is next. And what is important here is that it is kind of a reflection, and the reason why I'm being so quiet today is because this is kind of, for us, this roundtable is about sharing all our knowledge, but also the experience, and also hear and create a dialogue. And the importance of this, what is next, and we have 1 hour or 50 minutes for this, 45 minutes, is also to hear from all of you, the participants, what do you think that we should be, what is next, what should be next? And we have already discussed it on terms of the procedural, the substantive issues, the countries, and now we are gonna kind of to say kind of things that we think we should be happen, what should happen next. And some of you may also feel free to contribute in the chat and see whether you want to raise your hand, and we try to make this as interactive as possible. So first of all, we have Martin. I'm changing a little the order because we will have first Martin, then after Frederick, then after we will have Suranjali, Makiso, and then we conclude with Claudia Vargas. So we will have, for Martin and each one of you, we will have approximately 5 minutes. So we also have time for discussion. But let's hear first for Martin. Martin, you are going to the UN, I guess, or Frederick will go to the UN in 2 weeks. But what do you think what is next?
No, I had actually wanted to come last on this panel because I want to talk about what's next after next.
Okay, then I call you after Claudia, and then you will be
great.
next. Look, we are improvising here. So Frederick, please go ahead. What is next?
Okay, thank you. For that, I want to share a small slide. Where is it? There it is. I hope you can see that. So I think that for me, that summarizes a little bit the dilemma that currently is there for globally those that want this framework convention to happen. So probably you have to sacrifice either a broad participation, where participation of virtually all countries, or you have to sacrifice contentious topics such as corporate income tax and those topics that have already been dealt with at the OECD, or perhaps you have to sacrifice making very binding decisions that have an impact directly on transactions, on taxpayers, and that are not only at the level of principles. Either sacrificing either of them then has an implication on what you focus on. If you sacrifice binding decisions, then you focus rather at the level of the framework, the lowest common denominator, perhaps, what Peter and Ima talked about. You could choose also to just look at the future and see what topics are there where we can find consensus and do something useful. Or you can sacrifice broad participation and which would then eventually result in South-South cooperation. Potentially, these things can be reconciled in one instrument, especially if you get this this dynamic between a framework convention that is high level and protocols that may only by a subset right, or perhaps if you think about protocols as being different in nature, so where some may be more at some may be binding instruments that have a direct effect on how much tax you can raise on a specific income flow, or whether you have to give credit, etc., and others that can maybe be a bit more vague and be more at the level of principles. So probably this is not an actual trilemma, but nevertheless, I think proponents of the convention need to think about in which direction do you want to go, and in which direction do we where do we put our emphasis on? And right now, I think all of this is still possible. So all of this is still open. But that's something, I guess, for the negotiation committee where some further thinking should go there. Now, I think even on these items that I mentioned, there, some of them perhaps still have a question mark. Just to mention one of them is that I suppose here that proponents of the Framework Convention necessarily want binding decisions on contentious topics, and I think that's a moment where we still need more research to really see when and under what conditions is that really so. So one important thing to keep in mind, just to illustrate the point, is that right now the extent to which countries in the global south in particular have subscribed to the current existing international tax framework of the OECD varies a lot. So some have implemented a lot of the OECD standards, such as transfer pricing guidelines, or have concluded a lot of tax treaties, but others not necessarily. So countries that do not have any tax treaties, like currently, already have a lot of freedom in theory, at least, to implement tax policy that suits them. So there's still needs to be some thinking, some research about how can we reconcile these different or potentially different interests within the bigger group of the Global South. And I leave it there.
Thank you so much, Frederick. So we will go now to Suranjali. Suranjali, tell us, what is next?
I think what's next is, and it's sort of come out clear from the discussions today, is that there needs to be a firmer agenda. So I think the UN needs to firm up what the agenda will be, what topics will be covered. As you mentioned, Irma, there's already work being done on exchange of information. And so how does this interact? How does UN's work interact with the work that's already been done? I think it's absolutely critical on how voting is carried out and how these votes count in the decision-making process. There's also need for definitional clarity, and I think that will come when you have a convention which is put in place. But there should be definitional clarity and interpretation. Also, how do you enforce these? So how do you make sure that there is a common standard that you have created on fairness, on allocation of taxing rights? So how do you enforce that, or this is just a guiding principle, and then domestic policy and international tax policy can be left to individual countries? And so how does that come into play? The other thing which I thought of while talking in the previous panel about rights and obligations. So, for example, if you're talking about countries contributing towards the SDG agenda, also countries supporting others on capacity building, then there needs to be at least a sense of which countries will contribute to, say, a common pool or will support developing countries. And this need not be a neat sort of, develop sort of classic definition of countries. For example, in climate negotiations, you have Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries, which are sort of created by the UNFCCC. So it is possible, even under tax, to think about such categories of countries and then determine what the level of support should be for these countries. So I think it's really about how you define the agenda, how the funding will take place, and how do you enforce the various solutions that are thought of. Of course, I think we will have to live with the opt-ins and opt-outs, which means that there are multiple ways of achieving the same goal, and to build consensus, those different mechanisms that are available to achieve the goals, whether it's for dispute resolution, whether it's for climate tax. There are different ways to resolve these issues. And I think the different options should be available to countries to keep them within the system and to create broad consensus. So I think that's what's next.
Thank you so much, Suranjali. And I'm so happy that when we see here the panelists and we see people from political science, economics, but also having trade as well and law, but also having these interesting views of public international law as well, but also having like your experience, Suranjali, on the climate change and what you have done until now. It's very interesting to also share this. So thank you so much. So then let's go to Makiso. Makiso, please tell us what is next.
Thank you very much. Well, I think in the short term, what's next really is solidifying on procedural rules. Because when you talk about the structural framework, the essence of structural framework is procedural rules. And there was a component of them which were inserted in the zero draft, but it was very, very general, extremely general, especially in terms of the nature of bodies that are expected to be developed. But when we say solidifying procedural rules, those are the issues we're talking about with regards to consensus, with regards to voting, because that's where the real negotiation begins. But something which also wasn't mentioned, which was a critical factor as to why the push for developing countries came to set up an intergovernmental body is also agenda setting. Agenda setting in terms of how countries are able to advance proposals within the structure of the framework convention. Because when you talk about input legitimacy, that's where there was quite a lot of deficiencies with regards to the OECD inclusive framework, the G20 inclusive framework. But Emma, I know you're an expert when it comes to legitimacy. I read a couple of your articles on that. But okay, now just for practical reality in terms of overview of what is next in terms of where we are and what's going to happen. What I believe is that we're entering an era of preference seeking with two intergovernmental organizations which are going to run. Whether the UN Framework Convention is effective or not, at the end of the day, what I believe is going to happen is that we will have two bodies where developing countries and developed countries will seek preferences within these two organizations for international tax rules, which are relevant and core to their particular needs. And when we're talking about that Addis Ababa financing for sustainable development, the essence of that effectively was to address issues of resource mobilization. And this is at an international level. At a domestic level, yes, individually, countries are able to address certain factors, but that's exactly why you have the illicit financial flows as a protocol. That's exactly why you have other, what you might think is extraneous issues, like climate change. But we will have two intergovernmental bodies where countries will now preference seek or forum shop for issues which they want. And is that necessarily a bad thing? I don't think so. And then also we will have increased coalitions. It's something which both Suranjali and Martin had referenced. But what I find very interesting and is two things. One, how Africa has really solidified and united, and also the relationship it's starting to have with Latin America, especially on common issues with regards to, example, extractives and common areas of interest, and how rules and taxation are able to be developed which benefit them specifically with regards to common areas of interest. So there's going to be increased, and there is already increased coalitions, which would mean better proposals at this International Framework Convention. Thank you very much, Emma.
Thank you, Makiso. And let me then go to Claudia, and then after we will go to Martin. So Claudia, tell us what you can tell us. What is next?
Thank you, Irma. Regarding what is next, I would like first to emphasize, maybe from my experience as negotiator at the OECD, at the UN, and bilateral tax treaties, that bilateral and multilateral negotiations are challenging, always. And on tax matters are even more, because they touch countries' sovereignty and budget, and their resources. So what we are seeing, in my view, it's what will happen or what would happen in any negotiation, regardless of the fora and regardless of the countries participating. So there, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty at this point on what's gonna be next and what is gonna be, as Frederick said, no, as Martin said, what is going to be after the next steps. But definitely, I think that the process itself is important, is positive, and it will be, or it is very important for all countries involved, regardless of the different classifications of countries that there may be, to clearly identify, explain, and transmit their priorities to bring to the table. I think that when we start any negotiation, we all have like a wish list. But we have to be aware that we are on the table with other countries with their own wish list. And we may not be able all to have or to get all the results that we want in that wish list. But it is important for countries to really participate, to engage, and to try to get an outcome that will be positive for all. Also, regarding the timeline, just wanted to mention and to emphasize that by mid-August, the ad hoc committee should have a draft. I think it's going to be difficult. It is foreseen to be covered or to be discussed within 3 weeks. Although the idea would be to be able to do it faster, but still, by mid of August, we should have a draft proposal to bring to the General Assembly in October, and then a new resolution should be issued by the General Assembly, mandating the start of the negotiation of the convention itself, which is going to be also very challenging to have all these matters solved within a framework of 1.5 years or 2 years. And then we will have a convention, and then we will start, well, maybe a bit before, discussing more substantive issues with the protocols. But I believe that this is in general a very positive process, and we do really hope that we will have important and material and concrete results not by the end of this, because I don't see that this is going to have an end. This is like a starting point of a whole new process regarding tax matters globally. So I think that's positive. Thank you, Irma.
Thank you so much, Claudia. And then Martin, what is next after next? So please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to lean into the notion that this is a long process, and I think thinking about time is really important. So Frederick's trilemma was quite made me think. I remember at the very beginning, or near the beginning of what became the two pillars process, I remember going to one of the consultation meetings at the OECD, and against my better judgment, speaking from the floor, and I framed the strategic question here as being around a trilemma, where they needed to reconcile the breadth of participation, the depth of the reform they were trying to achieve, and the time and how quickly they would do it. I said I didn't think it was possible to have all these different states with different interests and a very ambitious reform agenda and to do it quickly. I said you have to choose two of those three. And we could discuss whether they achieved any of those three in the end. But I think that the time dimension is like somehow, I don't know how you fit it into your schema, Frederick, but to my mind, like some of what the literature in international relations says is the way you resolve that kind of trilemma, where you want to achieve a binding result, you want to do it with everybody involved, and you want to address contentious issues, is through a long negotiation process with multiple iterations. That's effectively how the climate process is working. And unfortunately, time is the one thing we don't have on climate, but it is achieving that goal of gradually building consensus on something which does tick all three of those boxes. So I think we could think about it in that light. So just a few quick things about the time dimension. The first is just to be clear on like on what the next steps mean. It seems to me like, as Claudia says, we'll know in August what the terms of reference look like, and while they have to be formally agreed by the General Assembly, unless there is a major shift in the underlying politics here, they will be approved. And so we'll actually have a period from August for maybe 6 months before anything really takes off, because that was the timeline last year. So although we had a year between resolutions, in practice there's only been 6 months to do the negotiating because of the timeline that the General Assembly process works on. So there's going to be like a 6-month vacuum in this process, starting in August. I, by the way, Emma, won't be in New York because I'll be on. I booked my family holiday far in advance for exactly those 2 weeks. So I think, first of all, we have to think about that long gap, how to use that long gap productively, how different actors, including those of us who are independent researchers and commentators, but also the countries, can use that long gap productively so that when the negotiations on the convention itself begin in 2025, they begin from a point, they don't just begin from a standing start. Second thing about that is that then this is going to be a long haul. So I think a lot of us have been thinking with like the 1 year horizon of what's currently going on, but this is a process which is going to run for at least 2 more years, longer than that, because in 2 years we may have a convention and no protocols. So this is a new institutionalized form of venue for negotiation, which is going to be negotiating for years. And that's how we should think about it, not just in terms of what happens in the next 12 months or 6 months or 1 month. That's why I think about, for example, repeated iterations being actually, in 2 years' time, the Bureau members for the new ad hoc committee that's formed will have had repeated time together. The ad hoc committee members also, such that by the end of 2 years, there'll be a much stronger sense of kind of social norms around how negotiation works, around what a more common understanding of what people are trying to achieve, than we have at this point in time. And that's the kind of thing to consider. I think another thing about the time dimension that I don't think anyone's mentioned, but apart from in the context of forum shopping, but I think is interesting, is what's the OECD and its bodies going to be doing in the meantime? Like, I think there's a bit of a, the 2 pillars will eventually grind to a halt, but the inclusive framework and the global forum and the new inclusive forum on carbon taxation, they're all going to be there. There'll be a drive for them to do stuff, but my sense is that countries' engagement with them, at least non-OECD countries' engagement with them, is a little bit lower in intensity now because there's this shift of focus towards the UN. So I think it will be interesting to see how the OECD bodies react to this kind of fairly long period during which there's this big other focus elsewhere, but it's not producing immediate legal or policy outputs. It's spending a lot of time focusing on institution building first. So I think, I don't really know what that will produce on the OECD side, but I think it's worth reflecting on a bit. And then the final point about time is about the negotiating capacity. And I think it was Claudia was talking about the just the narrative around not just shifting to a different forum doesn't change some of the underlying power disparities in negotiation. And I think that's absolutely that's something that very much our research over the years has definitely shown, is that there are some aspects of the reasons why negotiating outcomes don't always reflect the preferences of lower income countries that are not to do with the institutional venue, but they're to do with other factors. And a shift to the institutional venue at New York, it offers some potential to help try and counteract some of those factors. For example, there's better translation into more languages than you get at the OECD in a UN negotiation, which is one of the things we identified as a disadvantage. But it's an even more expensive city to be in. And the negotiations are taking place over blocks of several weeks, which is a really expensive way of, like, it requires being away for a long time and so on. And what I think these different aspects mean is that there'll be a different geography of power in the New York negotiations. And over time, what we would hope is that lower income countries find a way to navigate that in a way that they have gradually found at the inclusive framework. But part of what that's got to involve is strengthening the capacity of their UN missions to participate in these negotiations. One of the things I observed when I was at the ad hoc group is you had only a few countries where somebody who was based in the UN mission was speaking on their behalf, and they were making effective interventions in the negotiations. I think Pakistan was an example where the woman from Pakistan who spoke clearly had taken her brief, a very strong brief from home, but had also learned enough about the issues to be able to react to things. And she spoke very well. But for many countries, they didn't have a local capacity, and they were leaning on someone who'd flown from the capital for the duration of the negotiation, and that's going to be an untenable capacity drain, I think, and it's going to really affect. And for all countries, it's going to be difficult. But I think the capacity of the New York missions to do that for lower income countries is probably lower. So I think working out how to strengthen the capacity in New York that's resident there is going to be an important factor in using that time period to try and correct some of the less helpful dynamics we've seen in Paris. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Martin. And I just give you 2 minutes also what I think is next, since we still have time, unless that someone raised their hand, and otherwise we will conclude after giving the word to Peter. But what I think is important is that, I mean, we are in less than 11 years almost since the BEPS project started. Then we have the BEPS inclusive framework, then we have the Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and now we have the UN. And a lot of things had happened in the last 10, 11 years. But the question is, have we learned from it? Because the OECD and the G20 and also the European Union with the standard of tax good governance are already imposing these standards on transparency, exchange of information, and BEPS to develop and developing countries. And one of the questions we addressed in the Glove Tax Gov was, under what conditions can this setting up of standards by the OECD and the AU be legitimate and feasible for developed and developing countries? And I think the same question is for the UN. And the UN, what conditions we need to have for this now discussion of the Framework Convention to be legitimate and feasible for developed and developing countries. And also the question that we have, and I also addressed it in my inaugural lecture last year on global tax governance, is about the process. So the UN, but also the OECD and the AU should take care of the process. But the UN is so important because, as Makiso mentioned, in 2015, we were not even thinking about having an intergovernmental body because actually developed countries say, we don't want that. We already have the OECD as the leading role. But now we have this opportunity. So how we make sure that by having a good process in transparency, accountability, inclusiveness, and openness will be good enough for the countries to participate. So these are my reflections on what is next. And this is the challenge also of the UN. And unfortunately, I cannot be there in also 2 weeks. You know, you have to plan your holidays in advance. But I know that some of you will be there. And I'm looking forward to have and continue these discussions. But if there are any questions of comments, please raise your hand. Now is the moment to say what is next. And if no one says anything, then I will just give the word to Peter. But I'm very happy to see that we have 290 registrations. We have 100 people at one moment. Now we still have 55. So it means that we are doing something good. And this recording will also be available, as we mentioned, and we will share it with all of you. Peter, I give the word to you.
Yes, thank you. And I think it's a moment to say thank you to all the speakers and to all the participants. I've learned a lot, and it's great to see so many people on a Friday afternoon talking about tax, but I think it's an important moment in time. So I can just speak for myself, but I think Irma will agree this won't be the last roundtable on the UN Framework Convention. So stay tuned. We will definitely organize another one. And thanks again to all participants, all speakers. It has been really an interesting discussion, and enjoy the weekend or the rest of the Friday if you're in the US or in South America. So thank you all and see you soon. Huh?
Thank you so much. And what is nice, we end up even before time. So that is wonderful. So we can enjoy the weekend. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the speakers.
Thank you.
I hope it goes the same for the ad hoc group in New York, that they finish before time.
Let's see.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.